Hello and welcome to video lecture 5B, Marketing Ethics, Strict Liability and Vulnerability. This lecture continues the lecture 5A discussion of product responsibility by looking at the second major issue called strict liability. It then turns to ethics in promotion, focusing primarily on the issue of consumer vulnerability to manipulation. You'll recall from video lecture 5A that in negligence, the focus is on the actions of the supplier. However, in strict liability, the focus is on the performance of the product itself. The key question is, if injury is caused by the performance of the product itself and not because of any negligence in the value chain, then who is responsible? Notice that the sense of responsibility as culpability cannot be the dominant consideration here. The question is not who's to blame. If there were blame to assign, then we would be dealing with negligence. Someone didn't do what he or she was supposed to do or could reasonably be expected to do, and as a result, someone was harmed. Rather, the sense of responsibility that's in focus here is that of responsibility as caretaking. Damage has been done, which needs to be rectified. Invariably, such rectification is going to involve expense. So the question becomes, who's going to pay for this? Notice in negligence cases, the answer to this question is typically obvious. The one who was negligent, the one who was to blame, must pay to rectify the harm caused by his negligence. But in strict liability, there is no negligence, and yet damage has been done, and the rectification of that damage will cost money. If no one is to blame, then who's supposed to pay? This, by the way, makes sense out of a situation that used to be puzzling to me. You may hear of a settlement being reached in a damages lawsuit, where it's announced that the company involved will pay X amount of dollars in compensatory damages. And yet the settlement agreement will contain language to the effect that in agreeing to this settlement, the company neither admits nor accepts any culpability for the damage. What that's saying is, this is a case of strict liability, not a case of negligence. We didn't do anything wrong. It is very common in the aftermath of market exchanges for there to be damages for which no one is to blame. Accidents or action consequences that were not reasonably foreseeable are typical examples. But still, there will be medical bills, lost salaries, property replacement costs, etc., etc., and somebody's got to pay. The principle of strict liability says that the producer is responsible in the caretaking sense for any damage that the product causes as a result of normal intended usage. Notice, by the way, that we're back to talking about the producer. Unlike the previous lesson, the focus here is specifically on the producer and not generally on anyone else along the supply chain. So the producer is the one who should pay for the rectification of the damage, even though the producer is not to blame for the damage. It's important to note that, like so many concepts in ethics, this principle is prima facie. That is, it applies all things being equal. Nonetheless, it is possible for the principle to be overridden in certain circumstances. But it is the one who claims that it is overridden who bears the burden of proof to make the case. We assume producer liability unless there is good reason to assign liability elsewhere. Now, an example of damage without culpability will help clarify this situation. Consider a prescription drug that is tested and approved to the fullest extent of all FDA requirements. In fact, the pharmaceutical company even volunteers the drug for more rigorous testing than is required, and the drug is found to meet all safety standards. Nonetheless, after it has been on the market for many years, certain damaging side effects in long-term consumers are unarguably linked to the drug. Notice that no one is to blame in this situation. No one did anything wrong. The drug company complied fully with all requirements and even went above and beyond the call of duty to ensure the safety of their product. Nonetheless, the consumers suffering the damaging side effects require medical treatment, salary compensation, and other costly remedies, and somebody has to pay for them. The principle of strict liability says that, all things being equal, it is the pharmaceutical company that is morally obligated to pay. Well, this raises the obvious question, why? Why should the producer be held responsible for these expenses when they are no more culpable for the damage than anyone else? But this in turn raises the question, if not the producers, then who? There seem to be two other viable candidates. Perhaps the consumers themselves should pay. After all, if I have an accident that's completely unforeseen, and that is not the result of the usage of any particular product, then I'm the one who has to pay. People have to pay for things that happen to them. That's why we have insurance companies. Or perhaps society at large should pay. After all, government services provide for many other needs in the lives of citizens. Why not just throw this one into the mix? Given that there are viable alternatives, strict liability is a very controversial topic. There are two very common arguments that are often given against the principle. The first argument is that strict liability is unfair. After all, as we've just noted, the producer is no more culpable for the damage than anyone else. So singling the producer out as the one who must pay is arbitrary and capricious, therefore unfair and unjustified. It's unequal treatment without reason. The second argument is that it's costly, and not just to the producer. The producer will not simply absorb the costs and go on. The expense will be compensated for somewhere in the finances of the company, which will mean higher prices or reduced employee benefits or layoffs, etc. Neither of these arguments is particularly convincing. In fact, both are subject to the same basic rebuttal. Someone has to pay for the damage, and no matter who pays for it, you could raise these same objections to the claim that that party should pay. So whether you say the producer should pay, or the consumer should pay, or the society should pay, somebody could run both of these arguments against your claim, whatever it is. I mean, by stipulation, the damage is not the producer's fault. But it's not the consumer's fault or society's fault either. If there were culpability anywhere, the answer to the question who's going to pay would be obvious. So if it's unfair to make the producer pay, it would also be unfair to make the consumer pay, or to make society as a whole pay. Since unfairness applies to all alternatives, it cannot be raised as an objection to any one of them in favor of another. Likewise for the costliness objection. The fact is, no one will absorb the cost completely. If the consumer pays, the result will be bankruptcy or deep financial difficulties that will ultimately be absorbed by family or community or government. If society at large pays, the extra expense will be compensated for through reduced services, raised taxes, or some other extended burden. So it's going to be unfair and costly no matter who pays for it. So these cannot be arguments against placing the burden on any one party. These are not objections to strict liability. They are merely descriptions of the unfortunate but unavoidable consequences of damage without culpability. But what reasons might be given in favor of the claim that it is the producers specifically who are morally bound to pay for damage for which they are not culpable? There are three arguments that have been presented. However, the first two, like the two arguments against producer liability, aren't all that convincing. Nonetheless, we will look at them quickly since they are ones that may leap to mind and therefore need to be addressed. The first is the claim that the producers are best capable to pay. They're the ones with the money. However, the vast majority of producers are not large corporations with deep pockets. Rather, they are small businesses on shoestring budgets, often only one major unforeseen expense away from bankruptcy. The second argument is that making the producer responsible is an incentive to due diligence. In other words, if the producers know that they will be held liable for any damages their product causes, they will be much more careful to make sure the products are as safe as possible. But of course, the issue here isn't negligence. Strict liability is about damage that is not reasonably foreseeable. It's about damage that may occur even under conditions of the most meticulous due diligence. The argument that is the most convincing for strict liability is based on the fact that typically all it takes for the producer to benefit from a market exchange is for the exchange to take place. This is the main thing the producer has at stake. So, in a product liability case, the producer benefits from a transaction that harms the consumer. And from a moral point of view, there is something amiss about a party benefiting from a transaction that caused someone else harm. This is particularly the case when there is no blame to assign. If the harm were the fault of the consumer, then there is justification for concluding that the consumer has to bear the burden of rectification for the damage done. But in strict liability cases, no one is to blame, but still someone must pay for rectification. So here is a solid reason for the producer paying with some moral content to it. Because the producer benefited from an exchange that harmed the consumer, the producer is responsible for rectification. There really is no good moral reason for assigning such responsibility to the consumer or to society in general. Now let me say here that this is not the argument that is given in your textbook finally for producer strict liability. To be honest with you, I'm not really clear what that argument is supposed to be saying. But Desjardins, one of our authors, offered this argument that I'm giving here, that the producers benefit from consumer harm. He gives that in another book that he has written, and I think this is a good argument. I think it's the best one I've seen for producer strict liability. So this is the one we are using, but it is not the one given in the textbook. We now turn to the ethics of promotion. Recall that promotion is the attempt to persuade or convince the consumer to purchase a product. We will be looking specifically at advertising and sales, two of the largest areas of marketing. And in particular, we will be looking at attempts to influence consumers in their buying decisions. The act of influence always raises many ethical questions. Influence is an attempt to get someone to act in a certain way. But other people are free, autonomous beings who have the right to make their own choices. Any attempt to influence such choices runs the danger of interfering with that right. This raises the question, is there an ethically legitimate way to influence someone's decisions? Or is any attempt to influence the decision of another necessarily immoral? There do seem to be morally acceptable ways to influence decisions. For example, providing information that is necessary for people to be able to make informed and rational choices. Also, offering arguments for why one choice is better, more rational, more beneficial than the others, and advising someone concerning the choice, making a recommendation and giving reasons for that recommendation. These methods seem to be above board from a moral standpoint. We do not illegitimately influence the choices of another by providing information, argumentation, or advice. But why? What makes these methods legitimate? The key moral issue here is that the attempts to influence are explicit. The person we are attempting to influence knows that that is what we are doing. So everything is above board and out in the open. You are not trying to put anything over on anyone. Autonomy and control are protected. And any decision the person makes is made in full awareness of your influence. Therefore, the person has the option to accept or reject that influence. There are, however, ethically questionable and even clearly improper forms of influence. Many instances of illegitimate influence come in the form of manipulation. What distinguishes manipulation from other forms of influence is that manipulation is subtle. Manipulation is only manipulation if the person being manipulated does not realize what's going on. So manipulation is influence that is attempting to bypass the awareness and therefore the control and autonomy of the one being influenced. Contrast this with the explicit forms of persuasion just discussed and listed above. These people are aware of the attempted influence, free to consider it as they will, and free to choose the extent to which they will or will not be swayed by it. They are able to rationally reflect on the influence because they are aware that it's there. Manipulation is an attempt to bypass this explicit rational process. The goal is to influence people without them being aware that they're being influenced, and therefore without the benefit of rational reflection on the influence. Hence, it is easy for people being manipulated to make decisions they consider to be autonomous and free when they are not. Manipulation, therefore, is a form of deception. Manipulation is especially effective and therefore especially morally objectionable in cases where consumers are vulnerable in some way. Consumer vulnerability arises when certain people or groups of people have certain interests or needs that are of such urgency or importance that it would be especially easy to get them to behave in a certain way if they could be persuaded that such behavior would fulfill those interests or meet those needs. Consider, for example, state-supported lotteries. The clear fact of the matter is that the odds of anyone winning big in a lottery, big enough to create independent wealth for a lifetime, are so remote that spending significant amounts of money in hopes of such an outcome is unquestionably irrational. However, the advertisements that try to persuade people to buy lottery tickets do so by making it seem like there is a significant likelihood that a ticket purchase will solve all financial problems forever. It's been shown in many studies that the people most likely to spend substantial amounts of money on lotteries are the people who are least able to afford such discretionary spending, those on low or fixed or unstable incomes. This is because these people are financially vulnerable and therefore easily manipulated to believe that the lottery is a reasonable source of hope and opportunity for them. Therefore, advertisements specifically aimed at such people with the intent of creating such beliefs are manipulative and coercive and immoral. Another place where manipulation often takes place is in advertising to children. Children are particularly vulnerable to impulses of desire for immediate gratification. Parents are particularly vulnerable to pleas from their children for certain products. It is unfortunately very common for businesses to take advantage of both of these vulnerabilities, presenting advertising that excites children who then petition their parents, often persistently and insistently, who then buy the products to satisfy or placate their children. We can offer two general guidelines for ethical consumer influence in marketing. First, ethical consumer influence is that which seeks to discover and play to the independent predispositions, motivations, and desires of the target consumers. In other words, it's perfectly legitimate for companies to do research and discover what their target consumers really do want. It is also legitimate, then, to use that information to offer persuasion using information, argumentation, and other explicit forms of influence to try to convince consumers to fulfill their desires with your company's products. However, unethical consumer influence seeks to discover and play on easily influenced and manipulated, that is, on vulnerable consumers. There are two different ways consumers may be vulnerable to such manipulation. First are people who already have needs or desires that leave them open to easily manipulative persuasion. For example, elderly citizens with legitimate concerns about safety that are exploited with advertising designed to alarm or scare them. But also there are people who are open to easily created new and artificial desires. This is what is going on at most checkout aisles with products that will attract children, and they are prominently displayed in a part of the store that consumers with children cannot avoid.